Thank you, Lola, for that very generous introduction. And thank you for having me here again in Toronto, a beautiful city. I'm going to be talking this morning, and I won't be talking for 3 hours. You will be working part of that time, I hope. I'm going to be talking about interpreting in legal settings. How many of you already work in legal settings? Almost everyone here. So you are familiar with the requirements and the difficulties, the challenges of working in legal settings. And for those of you who haven't worked in that kind of context, you will learn from your table mates in the discussions that we're going to have about what is involved in being a legal interpreter. I think people are going to have trouble seeing the screen. You can see the white letters, but you can't see the dark ones. Could we turn off the first row of lights, possibly?
Yeah.
Is that okay?
Sí. No.
Now you can see it, you just can't take notes. I'm not sure how much you're going to want to take in the way of notes anyway. So what we are going to cover this morning is the role of the legal interpreter, and that is a very broad term, legal interpreter. As you'll see, it covers a lot of different areas. And we'll talk about the ethical principles and the standards of practice that govern interpreting in those settings, and how to prepare for assignments, and finally, intervention techniques, what you do when you need to take control of a situation that has gotten out of hand. First of all, what are the different settings that legal interpreters work in? Just from the audience, where do legal interpreters work? In the courts, lawyers' offices, jail, police stations, legal what?
Clinics.
Clinics, yes, law clinics,
Probation office.
the probation office,
Government of Canada website, refugee board, that kind of.
refugee board. At the airport, yes, immigration, yeah. So that's a huge variety of places. There's a difference between a courtroom and a law office and a jail cell. You can imagine the range of different communication dynamics that occur in places like that. So what is the role of the legal interpreter in broadly overarching role in all of those different legal settings? Can you sum up in one sentence what the role of the legal interpreter is? Can anyone do that for us? Well, if I don't have a volunteer, yes. No, I wasn't going to call on anybody. I was going to put your tables to work, but we have a volunteer.
The client who cannot express his or her rights, interpreters interpret for her his or her rights in own time.
The client who cannot express his or her rights, interpret for him or her in the target language.
Yes.
Does everyone agree with that?
Legal rights.
Legal rights. Yes.
Well, the role of the interpreter is to interpret, not word for word, because that's not really feasible, but meaning for meaning, and basically the first person, and exactly what is said by the client that you're interpreting for.
And who are your clients?
The non-English speaker.
Well, actually,
And the lawyers.
yes,
Yeah, and the
yes.
lawyers.
Your clients are both sides, and that is something important to bear in mind. I think everyone could hear that answer, right? Or do you want to repeat it? Yes.
I'll quote the definition that we give in the language interpreter training program, that we say that the role of interpreter is to deliver the message as faithfully as possible between individuals who cannot share the same language.
Yes, deliver the message as faithfully as possible between two speakers who do not share the same language. And all of the things you've mentioned are also true. You do meaning for meaning interpreting rather than word for word interpreting, and you assure people of their legal rights. You make sure that their rights are respected and that there is due process. But the definition that you just gave really covers any kind of interpreting. When you have two people or two parties that don't share a language, they need someone to convey messages back and forth. And that is essentially what you're doing. The complication is, who are those speakers and what are their relationships and what is the context of their interaction? Is someone in custody? Is someone a victim of domestic violence? All of those things enter into the communication that happens and therefore the role of the interpreter. Those of you who had some training in legal interpreting before they went into the field, if you took a course or a workshop or studied in a degree program on interpreting in general, had some sense that this was your role. How did it change when you actually worked in the field, when you put your skills to work with real live human beings in real situations? I would like you to take the next 5 minutes to discuss with your table mates how your real life experiences affected your perception of the role of the interpreter once you began interpreting. So I'll give you 5 minutes for that, and then I'd like the tables to report on a consensus.
We must.
what I'd like to do next is hear from the tables about, if you can sum up, and I imagine that a lot of it was war stories, anecdotes. If you could have one person from your table tell us the upshot of your discussion, an example of how your perception of the role changed once you started working as an interpreter. So I think the best way to do this is to designate the tables by name. So keep in mind that discussion that you had, and now that you know your table mates, I would like to give you 1 minute for each table to choose a name for yourself. You can choose, excuse me, wait until you hear the directions. You can choose an animal, you can choose a sports team, you can choose a place name, a number, whatever you like. Once you have an opportunity to speak for yourself, you can't stop. I know how that is. So, the table in front of the projector has
The Amazing Five.
the Amazing Five. I'm throwing myself a little map here. Yes, the next table.
Pretty colorful ladies.
Pretty colorful ladies.
Yes.
Next. Yes, the third table in. Legal eagle. Legal angels. Yes.
We are the voice.
The voice.
Yes.
Excellent. How about, yes, this table.
We're the legal eagles.
Yes.
The legal eagles.
Legal eagle. How about this table right here? The table that's second from the front?
Languages galore.
Languages galore. We have a few tables who haven't identified themselves. Yes.
Picturesque table.
Picturesque table? A picturesque table. You were inspired by all the art on the walls, I imagine. Way in the back corner.
The refugee board.
The refugee board. Two other tables in the back. Dream team. And the back corner.
True boys.
True boys.
Yes. True boys. So the true boys. The true boys.
I thought it was the name of some boy band or something. All right, and this table in front has our speaker dignitaries. Did you choose a name for yourself?
Dignitaries table.
A thorn among roses.
A thorn among Okay. So, I would like to ask the true voice, excuse me, if we could all be talking about the same subject at once, that would help. Could the true voice please tell us what your table decided was one typical example of how your experiences in the field affected your perception of the role of the interpreter? The true voice.
The true voice is made up of primarily newbies. Our experience would be 0 to almost 0. So we're here to learn and hear.
All right.
Why don't you switch spots with some seniors?
Yeah, with legal.
Well, if you want to change teams at some point, you're welcome to. Well, how about our legal eagles?
I believe that emotional situation do affect our emotions. But I would give you example, the language, target language, interpretation stays same. But if the client is sad and the story is very sad, I always see my tone of voice is changed, but the interpretation is same. Sometimes I believe my eyes are wet, but I am in a control. My interpretations and wording to wording is same, and I'm faithful.
All right, thank you. How about the refugee board?
We have discussed how in the real life, whenever you are in court and you try to make happy the defense lawyer, the crown attorney, and the judge, and then you suddenly find out that the witness has got great education and he speaks a dialect, and you have your eye language, and these people, these 3 parties that I just mentioned, they insist that you translate verbatim. So there's a problem.
Yes, indeed.
As you probably know, that the lawyers are very resistant at abandoning their eye language. So once the double negatives arrive, and the questions about trying to trap perhaps the witness, and then you have to use a verbatim translation. You get the response that is normal and huh? What? Me? So then you're unfortunately, and this is where it becomes hard for the interpreter, your qualifications come into question. So, and being in front of those three parties, you cannot explain that in fact the problem is not the translation, but the level of education, the level of language being used.
Yes.
This is something that it's made me shy away from being in court.
Well, that's unfortunate.
I'm not a hero. But
Well, it's
this is
impossible.
Give me some food for thought.
Thank you. It is impossible to prepare anyone for the experience. In a classroom, you can't recreate the dilemmas that you have, and you just have to figure out your own ways of dealing with that. But as you were talking, I was thinking of one of those medieval torture machines where they pull the different limbs in different directions. That's what you feel like when you're in an adversarial courtroom. How about the voice?
Still haven't gained any experience.
Oh, that was the true voice.
There's two voices.
We have,
going from one language to another. But what the value? So, but then what? So, okay, you're there to help people, but the thing is, once you're there, you have to stand back, respect what they say. You're just interpreting. So you have a perspective, not only of the speaker, you have to be out of it.
you have to be both in and out.
Huh?
You have to be both in and out
Right.
of the
That's
situation.
how you learn.
Yes.
How to be a better interpreter, how to be a better person. That's what I like about interpreting.
Okay, thank you. That is the true voice. What about the voice?
Okay, so we, from our discussion, we think being an interpreter in the legal setting, it's not only to master the terminology, the legal terminology, but also it requires a high level of fluency in the two languages in terms of nuances, which I find, like I would get stuck on that more than get stuck on thinking about a legal terminology. So I think it's really knowing the languages inside and out with all the nuances, the idioms, that would bring the language alive and to be able to give that seamless transition in the court setting, or legal setting, which would really make a difference when you see an experienced interpreter versus an inexperienced one.
Yes.
So it's very important for legal interpreters to continuously to develop and enhance that fluency in terms of knowing like the slangs, the nuances, all that kind of stuff.
Very good. How about the pretty colorful ladies?
Well, as court interpreters, some of us around this table, we recognize that from experience that the stakes are much higher in the court system due to the high risk and responsibility which may cause mistrials or errors in judicial judgments, and as well as the outlook from the experience faced in court. The interpreter recognizes that knowledge of the legal system is paramount to the interpreter, as well as the different challenges faced by the court interpreter in dealing with the different regional registers of the different parties, the non-English speaking parties, as well as the change of register from formal several times during the proceedings, from formal to informal, as well as to these regional dialects. These are some of the reasons we can to recognize out of our experiences or our role in the court interpreting.
Thank you. The Amazing Five.
Okay.
Yeah, we spent some time actually to negotiate who is going to ask the question and who is going to answer. So we were able only to discuss only one example actually, that how the role was changed, the perception of role was changed in a real setting, legal setting, was that the role, that the situation is actually more intense, more stressful, there is a lot of pressure. And then our colleague said, I felt actually as the most important person in the room, although I disagree with that, but we didn't spend much time in discussing that, but she said, yes, the lawyers intend to diminish the role of an interpreter, so I felt that I'm on the same level as a lawyer because I'm interpreting for them because they cannot work without me. And another colleague said, yes, but how could it be that you are not paid as lawyer, as much as lawyer? And then she came to the point that she said, I called my agent and I said, you know what, this was a legal setting, a lot of the legal terminology. This is more worth it than $25 per hour. So that is, in essence, let me see whether I in essence, that what she was trained as a legal interpreter was changed in the legal setting because of the pressure and more tension than she
More
expected.
pressure, more intensity than
Yes.
you expected.
Yes.
And unfortunately not remunerated
Exactly.
commensurately.
Exactly.
Okay, thank you.
Well,
How about our languages galore table?
We discussed and agreed on necessity for the interpreter to be very flexible. I think that no matter how well an interpreter is prepared for his job on this particular day, for this particular assignment, but very often something unexpected comes out, and people have to be flexible.
Yes.
So we have to know, definitely we have to follow the rules, but very often we have, as many people said here, we have to change the register of the language. Because not everybody can understand the legal language and legal terms.
All right. Flexibility is the key. The legal angels.
Okay, so there are a couple of issues that we encountered. The first thing is that because it's a legal setting, what happens is that so many times the non-English speaker sort of looks to the interpreter for advice. They almost want like our opinion. They want to, they want to know like if it's a good idea, especially if it's like a legal issue, like a car accident or whatever the case may be. They're always looking to us for some sort of guidance, and it's really important to like really separate yourself from that. Like still remain professional, still keep like that that respectability, still keep that I guess that bond sort of like to establish some sort of rapport, but you have to stay objective. So you have to try to sway from giving any opinions, and you have to explain to them somehow in some sensitive way that this is not something that you can do. As well, the other thing that in the legal setting, because sometimes some issues are so horrific, it's really difficult to stay detached and to keep the emotions out of interpreting, because some things are so horrific that your personal issues may contradict so much with what's happening that it's really hard to stay objective. But as an interpreter, you have to stay objective. You have to realize that this is a job, and then arises the fact that you have to actually distance yourself, and after that you have to find some way to de-stress, because these are things that could really affect, I guess, your psyche. So it's really important to establish that rapport in these, especially these horrific settings, because it's always better for the interpretation if you have some sort of rapport, but you stay impersonal at the same time. So you stay true to the message. You make because the situation might be so horrific that you want to establish some sort of environment that the non-English speaker feels comfortable to speak, especially if it's like such a traumatic experience that you could experience in the legal settings. So you want to make them comfortable. At the same time, you want to stay true to the message. So it's something that you have to try to keep the emotions out, but you have to empathize at the same time.
A lot of tension between the different aspects of your code of ethics. I'm hearing a theme here that a lot of you are mentioning the pressure and the intensity and the dilemmas that you didn't anticipate perhaps when you got into court interpreting. What about the picturesque table?
Well, we were discussing first that although the perception of the role doesn't really change from real setting to from training to real setting, it sometimes I was actually giving an example from my experience where the lawyer asked a question to his client, which was a leading question, and this was at the IRB, and the member had stopped the question, but I had already started to interpret it, and the member was not happy about that because the question was leading. Sometimes this kind of thing happens where you are there as an impartial body, but then you kind of have to take the lead from the judge or the presiding member in a court setting. That doesn't happen in other settings as much.
All right. And the dream team. What does the dream team have to tell us?
I think that a fair bit of our discussion turned on some of the same issues as the legal eagles, but from a different perspective. That the person who doesn't speak English feels that you're their friend, or somehow has this special rapport with you and that you will help them or advocate for them, and that's not your role. And you have to find a way to create that distance. And they sometimes don't get that part, but that you're there just to facilitate the communication, not to answer their queries, be on their side, or any other thing.
Thank you. So you may have a firm idea of what your role is, but other people have mistaken notions of what you're there for. And finally, the thorn, I believe this is finally, the thorn among roses.
One issue can be not realizing that your role is to be the scapegoat. How many times does the lawyer say there must be a problem with the translation because I can't believe you would have said X, Y, Z.
Thank you. Very good contributions to the discussion. So let's look at the tenets of the Code of Ethics, and there isn't just one Code of Ethics. We all have different codes depending on where we work, but generally they have in common these features: that you want to be accurate, you should be faithful to the message, and interpret all of the message without omissions or additions. Secondly, you need to remain impartial or neutral, and working in an adversarial system makes that very difficult. Third, you need to maintain confidentiality. Fourth, professional demeanor and detachment, or distance, professional distance, whatever you want to call it. And next, something about integrity, honesty, being honest about your qualifications, and being willing to admit when you don't know something, not accepting assignments for which you're not qualified, and so on. And finally, professional development, a commitment to lifelong learning. You're always trying to learn new things about your languages, about the legal system, about the people you're working with. So those are the black and white words that go into most codes of ethics, which is what you're taught in your training courses to become court interpreters. But what do they mean in real life? And we've heard from all of you some of these points. I tried to anticipate what you might be discussing. When you are committed to interpreting with accuracy and completeness, that includes very distasteful messages, racial remarks, xenophobic remarks, things that you find personally offensive, or foul language that is very difficult for you to reproduce. Another aspect of accuracy and completeness is incoherence. When you practice in class, you usually have someone playing the role who is understandable, who makes sense. And when you get out into the real world, you find a lot of times people say things that don't make any sense. And yet you have to interpret them. And you're not prepared for that. What do I do when I'm transferring from one language to another? Utter nonsense. Very difficult. Or the lack of equivalence. When the lawyers and the judges are expecting this so-called verbatim interpreting, and you need to provide a meaning-based interpretation, which may take longer. Or you may have a much more succinct way of expressing the idea in your target language, and you take less time. If someone is sitting there counting words, and sometimes they do, you can be in a difficult spot. If there simply is no equivalence between the two languages, you have to provide a paraphrase or a gloss. What about ambiguity? Something can be ambiguous in the source language, and sometimes you recognize that it's ambiguous, but you can't keep that ambiguity in the target language. You need to commit yourself to one or the other, or you don't realize that it's ambiguous, and you take one interpretation of it and interpret that, and it turns out that what they meant was something else. And then that looks like the interpreter is incompetent because they don't realize they're ambiguous, but when you render it in the other language, it becomes erroneous. And the proscription against providing explanations. Interpreters are not there to explain the law, they are not there to advocate or speak for people, but I'm sure that a lot of you have been in situations where you really felt it was essential that you explain something because there is such a huge gap between the parties that you're working with. And where does that fit into the code of ethics? You're not supposed to provide those explanations, and yet you are supposed to bridge the communication gap. In terms of impartiality and neutrality, it's almost impossible to repress normal human responses. You mentioned tears coming to your eyes, your voice changing when you're interpreting, and it's a real struggle to maintain your composure when you are interpreting traumatic language, people describing things that are horrifying or that are repugnant to you, things that are just repulsive. It's very difficult to continue on the neutral middle line without being swayed by the kinds of things that you have to interpret. And I think student interpreters also don't anticipate how much pressure they're going to come under to take sides in an adversarial setting. Another problem is that people simply misunderstand each other regardless of language or culture. we go into interpreting because we like to communicate, we like to help other people communicate, we love language, and yet when we get into the situation, we find that we can't make everyone understand. We can't make everyone happy. They're not going to go away satisfied that justice was done in every case. And that hurts. It's hard to watch something that you think is unfair or see a negative outcome. And it's difficult to prepare anyone for that experience. And just the huge language and culture barriers that you come into a situation unprepared for. You know that they exist out there in the abstract, but dealing with a real cultural barrier is very difficult. You know in principle what you're supposed to do, but what do you actually do is the question. Now, with regard to the tenet of confidentiality, there are certain exceptions to the confidentiality rule. If someone is in imminent danger, if their life is in danger or a crime is about to be committed, you have an obligation to reveal to other parties the information that you interpreted. Or if there is a violation of the law, if a lawyer tells a client to do something that you know is illegal, you are supposed to report that according to most codes of ethics. And there is a whole issue of, I'm not sure if the term is used here, but in the States this is called mandated reporters. When you are working in a case with children or with the elderly or people with mental disabilities, people who are vulnerable, if there is some kind of abuse going on that you come to know about in your professional interaction with them, you have a legal obligation to report that information to the authorities. And that is in total contrast to the confidentiality principle of our code of ethics. So you have a tremendous dilemma in deciding how to proceed. Interpreters are usually not included explicitly in the list of professions that are considered to be mandated reporters, and yet we're right there in the middle of it. When you need to consult with colleagues about something, it's very difficult not to reveal facts about a case. When you need to ask about a term or a situation, how would you handle this? And so the confidentiality provision sometimes gets in the way, or sometimes we aren't quite in compliance with it because of our need to pursue another tenet of the Code of Ethics, which is continuing education and expanding our knowledge. And another prohibition that interpreters have in our Code of Ethics in the US, this is specifically stated that we cannot make any public comments about a case. And a lot of times you're asked by someone outside the case, what happened, or what do you think, or how did it go, and you want to talk about it, but you're not able to. How do you decompress after a stressful situation without violating the confidentiality provisions? And this is closely related to that, maintaining professional demeanor and detachment. If you're working with children, that's impossible. And I think that the expectations are different for all of the people involved. If you work in juvenile justice, in dependency proceedings with children, or with people who have mental illnesses, the lines are blurred in terms of how detached you are, how much you intervene to see that some sort of communication happens. There may be a huge mistrust that no one can overcome because of past trauma. I'm sure that those of you who work with refugees experience this. There is no way that this person is going to want to discuss incidents that happened in front of strangers, and they may not trust the interpreter because it could be that they've been betrayed by interpreters in the past. Just client relations in general, as business people, you need to be able to get along with all of the people you work with, and sometimes that's very difficult just because of personalities and circumstances. And finally, your personal safety. In criminal justice, sometimes we find ourselves in situations where we are with dangerous people or in dangerous situations, or possibly threats to health if someone has a contagious disease and you're interpreting for them. So all of those things come into play when we're trying to remain detached and professional, and I'm just an interpreter, I'm not personally involved. Sometimes that's impossible. With the provision of integrity and honesty, sometimes it's really difficult to turn down assignments, or the client won't let you turn it down. They say, look, you're the only person, I'm desperate, we need somebody there tomorrow morning, and you're the only person who's answering the telephone. And often it is a middleman, it's someone who's not going to be there, he won't suffer from the outcome of the case. Usually the people calling interpreters never have any personal experience with the situations that the interpreters get involved in. So it's really hard to say no, not to mention the fact that you need the income if you're freelance. You come under a lot of pressure from clients to do things that you don't think are right. We have a tenet in our Code of Ethics in the US about reporting impediments to practice. And what that means is if you feel that you cannot interpret accurately or interpret well according to all these standards because of the circumstances, you can't hear properly, or you can't see, or someone is being disruptive and interfering with your concentration, or you've been interpreting for 3 hours straight and you haven't had a break. It's very difficult for interpreters to intervene and say, Your Honor, the interpreter needs a break, or Your Honor, could the speaker be asked to slow down? Or you have people who mumble or who have a speech impediment. And it's really difficult to have to keep on asking the court, could that be repeated? Could that be repeated? Because you're simply having trouble understanding someone. And that is a sign of your integrity, that you're honest with the court, but it can be very irritating to people, and it's embarrassing. And then there are moral temptations, and we've heard about some of these. It's not right versus wrong. There are some things that are obviously wrong. If someone says, will you take a bribe to interpret well for my client, will you interpret in favor of my client and distort the testimony? Of course that's wrong. We all know that that would be improper. But the right versus right dilemmas are the ones that are the most difficult. On the one hand, I have an obligation to interpret accurately and all of the meaning contained in the message. On the other hand, I'm not allowed to explain anything. And I can't possibly interpret the full meaning of this message without providing an additional explanation. So how do I reconcile those two competing ethical interests? That's what makes our job so difficult, and why a lot of you are talking about the intensity and the pressure. The commitment to professional development and lifelong learning is something that I think everyone agrees with. No one would disagree with that. But it can entail a lot of expense. You have to pay to attend courses, and you need to, if you subscribe to publications or purchase books, dictionaries, that kind of thing, there's quite a bit of expense involved in that, and some of you have mentioned that we're not paid all that well, and those are just extras that no one takes into consideration. Your time is involved also in continuing education. All of you took time out to come here today, for which I'm very grateful, but that's time taken away from something else in your life. And sometimes things are during the work week, you have to not work on a day to attend a session or to take a course at a college. Sometimes that means turning down work. So these are really difficult commitments to follow through on in some cases. So I would like you to discuss in your tables, and what we call this a buzz group, if it's going to be a lot of buzzing in the room. I have, and this is on your handouts, there are 3 questions that I would like you to discuss among yourselves. And I'm going to assign a specific ethical tenet to each of you. I don't know where the handouts are in the packet.
They're in the bags.
In the back, in the bags. There's one that has a list of these questions with different ethical tenets. Have you ever been pressured or tempted to stray from the ethical tenet that your table is going to be discussing? Have you ever felt that an exception was warranted? I know that the Code of Ethics...
Sorry, we didn't hear you. If you don't mind to repeat it, because there's a lot of noise around. And I
Okay,
apologize.
thank you for speaking up. That's what interpreters need to do.
Thank you.
Have you ever felt that an exception was warranted in that you know that the Code of Ethics says one thing, but you have to do something different, but you feel that it's justified because of the circumstances? And thirdly, do you think the wording of the tenet should be modified? And you know what your own Code of Ethics is here. You know how it's worded. Would you propose any modifications to that based on your answers to the previous questions? So, I'm going to assign tables to discuss 4 different aspects of the Code of Ethics, because not all of them really can be discussed all that fruitfully. But the tenet about accuracy, faithfulness, and completeness, I would like the true voice in back. And I know that you're newbies, but you have, in your experience, at least in courses or in informal interpreting, you probably have that kind of situation come up. The true voice, the picturesque table, and the amazing 5. You are all going to discuss the accuracy and completeness tenet. True voice, picturesque table, and amazing 5, accuracy. The next thing is confidentiality. And I would like the pretty colorful ladies and languages galore to discuss confidentiality. Impartiality. Please refrain from talking so that everyone can hear their assignment. Don't start your discussion yet. Impartiality is going to be the refugee board and the thorn among roses. Impartiality. And the voice, the legal angels, and the dream team are going to discuss professionalism, professional demeanor, and attachment. And I think I left out the legal eagles. Yes, you are going to discuss confidentiality. Does every table now know what its remit is?
You missed the thorn among roses.
No, I gave them an assignment. They're discussing impartiality. What did I give to the dream team? Professional demeanor? Okay, thank you. All right, so I would like you to choose one person at your table who is going to write down the consensus that you reached in response to these questions. And I'll give you 15 minutes to discuss them among yourselves, and then we'll ask for some reporting back. All right, 15 minutes, which will make it about 10 after 10.
Times. Well, once again, is the sequence. It's like I'm looking at the spectrum of what she's talking about, she's having. I tried the legal and the other ones I and once again, I was able to keep reasons. It wasn't so hard, but it was so was psychiatry. So that can be looked at. The legal itself, I think it's hard for the ones in the I think that sometimes once again, when you're feeling that people are pressured to do something that they don't you know, and how great once again. This is my job. I can't live here. I can do anything else other than being faithful. No, it's not. And I guess that, for instance, when I talk about working that makes it easy because I have so many times that I allow this to have discussion for after. And if I'm in the outside session, then it totally changes the picture. These people don't believe it. And I cannot take it where so it's so different when you actually are involved, like say,
to stop. Thank you. I know you probably came up with some really interesting stories to tell. Interpreters are always full of stories. So, first of all, those of you who discussed can't talk today, accuracy and completeness, did you come up with a situation in which you were pressured or tempted to not interpret everything, or to interpret a little bit differently from the way someone said something? So let's hear from the amazing five. Can you give us an example of a situation?
We actually had a huge discussion and debate actually here because one of our members said that it should be what was the third question? Sorry, I apologize.
Have you ever been pressured or tempted to stray?
Do you think the tenant should be modified?
Oh, okay, you're on the third.
Yes,
Wait, hold on.
Okay.
I want to ask these questions one at a time. So, if you want to discuss the modification, can you wait for a moment?
Oh, yes. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. However, we have actually one example for the first
Okay,
question,
thank you.
so you can explain your situation. I can give a summary what he said, actually, that because he's hesitating. If you want to, yeah, go ahead.
I'm Shafiq, and I don't interpret in the court, but I have interpreted in social assistance and other settings. As most of the times I have experienced that sometimes I have to, explain something to be very accurate and also go out of my role boundary. For example, sometimes the caseworker leaves the paper and the rights and responsibility when you come to social assistance and you are now in Canada. So just to translate, or in this one, as when I go and bring the photocopies of the IDs. So I explained my role boundary, but I have to, I did it. I know it's against my ethical conduct, but I did it, and
what is it that
the caseworker was not.
Why did you? Because the service provider left the room. And
Yeah, I was alone, but I did it.
You do it all.
So, did you sight translate the form?
Yes.
And is that against the rules? Are you not supposed to sight translate documents?
But I know that when you study the interpreting, they say, oh, you should not be alone with the client.
Okay.
But this is one rule. So also sometimes the caseworker doesn't know, for example, some specific information where it is like in the record of landing, the period of sponsorship is mentioned, either 3 years or 10 years. And when they finish the whole information, they finish the intake and everything, they say, oh, I can't give you any assistance right now till you bring me, a letter from your sponsor that you finished this, you completed this 3 years. But it's written in that paper that, 3 years, so if you calculate the date of landing, it's there. So sometimes I had to take side with I said, this is not my role, but it's written clearly here. You can check in the record of landing. I went out of my role boundary.
Okay.
So in fact, he was doing the role of a service provider, not the role of an interpreter.
Okay.
He didn't stay completely in the role.
Playing a different role. All right. Now the next question, still we're talking about accuracy and completeness. Have you ever felt that an exception was warranted? You could justify the fact that you did not interpret a complete message, or you interpreted differently from the way it was originally stated. Let's see, the picturesque table.
We were actually discussing the questions with each of the tenants.
Oh, you didn't focus only on accuracy and completeness?
No,
Okay.
within accuracy, all the points that you mentioned in your presentation, we discussed it like that. So client says the non-English speaker is talking, and then the lawyer's like, don't answer that question, and the other lawyer's like, oh, what did they say? And the message is lost there because you couldn't hear one person over the other. And so you do have to step in and keep saying, or people get angry with you because they expect you to be super bionic here, or whatever you call it.
And have 3 voices.
Yes.
So you have to make an exception. It's justified because of the limitations of the real world. We work in one dimension, time-wise, and we can only interpret one message at a time. When we're hearing several different messages and everyone wants all of everything interpreted, that's a physical impossibility. And in terms of, do you think the tenet should be modified? I'll come back to the amazing 5. You had a statement about a modification.
Yes, we had a discussion actually about that. I mentioned one example when I interpreted the Immigration and Refugee Board. Although I, as a trained interpreter, I really always stay within my role as an interpreter and always respect code of ethics. So, but that hearing was really very, very difficult, and the member was using the word gypsy, and the person nearby me was simply locked up. They were circling with questions half an hour. The hearing didn't go anywhere. The person was mumbling something. I was asking, what did you say? The person didn't repeat what he said. And the hearing went nowhere. And I have realized actually that the huge problem was in that in the interpretation and the usage of word gypsy. So I raised my hand, although I was struggling very much whether I'm going to do it or not. And I decided, because I have realized that that really situation was completely going nowhere. And I said, Madam Member, could I step, not of an interpreter, could I step out of my role as an interpreter and say that gypsy word in our language, in the native language, sorry, I said in the native language of the claimant is very derogatory word. And they consider themselves Roma. When I was explaining this, one of the members of my team said, oh, why you didn't interpret gypsy Roma? I said, because gypsy is gypsy, Roma is Roma. I cannot interpret gypsy as Roma. So it is a huge difference.
What modification would you propose to the wording?
In those kind of situations, when you are aware that the word is really derogatory word, and then when the hearing, I'm talking about the refugee process, the claimant was Roma person. He was claiming that is the base of his whole claim, that he was discriminated, and that discrimination amounted to persecution. So that is a backbone of his claim.
Yes, yes. What modification do you
that
think?
The interpreter has right to say in those situations that the interpreter could give that short explanation about particular word without giving evidence, without giving any other suggestions, just to clarify that the word has a derogatory meaning in a particular language.
Okay, so you think that the tenet about accuracy, completeness, no additions, no omissions, should contain some provisions about providing an explanation for the sake of meaning.
Exactly.
Transfer.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
Okay. And someone else at your table has a comment.
Yeah, that's basically what I was going to say. It's like you mentioned earlier that we're not supposed to give any explanation, but we're also supposed to make the bridge for the gap of communication. And if we feel that that bridge is not being made, I think the text should be modified in the way that.
Okay. So some clarification, perhaps some background information accompanying the Code of Ethics that would explain the circumstances under which an explanation might be justified. Yes?
With all due respect, I strongly disagree with that attitude. There's a big difference between making a technical clarification when the wording in one language doesn't have an exact equivalent in the other, or may have two different ones, or be ambiguous. That may actually hamper the process of communication between the two languages. That's definitely okay. But I strongly disagree with telling someone what language to use or not use. If the judge or the member of the refugee board, or the lawyer for that matter, is using negative words such as gypsy or nigger or whatever other words, it is my job as an interpreter to convey that and let them sort it out. Because if it was a conversation between an English-speaking client,
No, you didn't understand it.
I did clearly. You told the judge that was a negative word to use.
Order in the court. We'll save these discussions for the break because this is something that's very important and there is going to be disagreement about it. I saw a hand up in back.
Yeah, I just want to offer my take on this. Whenever you offer an explanation, you can act, and I think this is a legal principle, as it's called in Latin, curius amicus curia, and explain that to the judge. And you step, as she said, out of your role momentarily because you're a friend of the court. And then you go back into your role. I don't think there's
Okay, thank you. Now, moving along.
Just one sentence only. When I said this at the Immigration and Refugee Board, then the claimant opened, because even his lawyer, who was a Canadian lawyer, didn't know the difference. Then the claimant opened and then said, oh yes, just because they were calling us gypsies, they didn't give us a job, we were discriminated, we didn't have social security and this and that. So that in that sense, I felt that was justified.
All right, thank you. Now, turning to the confidentiality provision of the Code of Ethics. Do the pretty colorful ladies, please, do the pretty colorful ladies have an example of a situation? Please, if we have your attention. We'll have a break in a few moments and you can have all the arguments you like over the topic. Colorful ladies. Yes.
Yes, we have some examples. First of all, I have to say that to me, this is the most important tenet as an interpreter, because how are they going to trust the interpreter if you don't assure them that you're going to keep everything confidential? So nothing is happening to me personally, but there are two interpreters here who would like to share some experience. First,
Very briefly, an example when you were tempted or pressured to stray from the confidentiality provisions.
Okay, this was a case involving a lady trafficking in persons, and I was called over the phone to interpret. 2 months later, I received a call from her lawyer telling me that they need me to interpret for them as well for this lady, because there is some information that I know that is going to help this lady stay out of jail. Thinking about it, I thought that this would be breaking confidentiality and as well as maybe some issues of conflict of interest, and then they promised that to give me the amount of money that I would dictate. And thinking about it, I rejected the whole deal, and I explained why, because of this confidentiality tenet as an interpreter, but they did not settle for that. 2 hours later, I received a call from the police telling me that they need me to come and attend because this lady needs that I repeat what went over the phone with the officer at that time because she's unable to, she missed a few things and she wanted this interpreter to help. So again, I stood tenaciously on my ground and I said there's no way, and first of all, I I don't keep copies. They wanted my notes. They asked me if I have notes, and I said I do write notes, but I turn them as soon as any assignment is over. They pressured me maybe for a week almost, calling me almost every day, the police with threats, so that if I don't come, they will take me to court. This interpreter immediately announced to them that I'm ready to go to court at any time, and this is what I will tell the judge, that according to my interpreter code of ethics of confidentiality, first of all, I don't remember 2 months ago because I don't keep any memory about and I'm interpreting every day. Secondly, there is no way, even if I knew, I would reveal anything. And they will not badge. At that time, I was working for Cabbage, and I knew the coordinator who is here, Stella Rahman, so I phoned her about what to do to get advice. She stood supported and stood very strongly with me, and she talked to the police, but the police would not badge. Anyway, finally, I had to refer them to another agency that I worked for, which was NCIS. I took my case there, and they did talk with them, and they spoke with them very hard, actually to the police, and at that it was wrong. But the pressure was very strong.
Sounds like very strong.
The temptation
pressure.
was very high,
Yes.
a lot of money, but
Yes.
and they promised on the phone that they will not tell anybody, they will not call me, they will not drag me to any kind of issues, and they gave me all kinds of promises, but
Good.
on one issue, I told the police that if they continue to call me, I'm going to sue them for harassment.
All right, thank you.
The special
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we need to move on. Is there a modification that anyone, yes, I'm sorry to cut you off, but we need to stay on track and the other people have things they want to say too. Is there a modification to the provision on confidentiality that any of the tables that discussed confidentiality, and that is both the pretty colorful ladies and languages galore and the legals also, would you propose a modification in the
Well, I don't know
language?
exactly how it is defined in the US, but here in Canada, the language interpreter training program, we define confidentiality like this, and everybody at the table agreed that interpreters will not disclose and will treat as confidential all information learned, either uttered or written, in the performance of the professional duties, unless given permission by the parties or unless required by law, which gives us some leeway.
Okay, so you don't think any modification in that wording is needed because it covers the circumstances that you described? Yes.
I am from the legal table, so all knows. I'm going to give an example, and this example would be relevant with that example too, but with little bit difference. It was not a legal clinic. I was working for an insurance company, and there was a client who was in the clinic, and I was working for that client. And the client was not able to walk, not able to carry anything. Even in the break, he was asking the service provider, please hand me a glass or a cup. I have no strength in my hands. And service provider was doing that. And after finishing the assignment, the client is leaving, and I'm waiting. He would be a little bit distance, then I go. Otherwise, they always jump to us and ask the inner side information. That's our technique. So I was on the distance. He's going there, and a service provider is there. I don't know he was there until he called me. And after 5 minutes walk, the client is walking as he have no disability, as he have nothing to do with him. And I am surprised too, but it is in my mental note. And then I saw service provider said, Stacy, did you witness how nicely he is walking? Could you provide me this witness towards my case? I said, sir, I cannot give the value, opinion. He said, you witness with me. I said, you have to send me subpoena, I will be there.
Okay. Actually, that sounds a little bit more like the impartiality provision. They're asking you to take sides. and testify as a witness in a case rather than being an interpreter. All right, we don't have much time before the break, so the next tenet about impartiality, which you made a nice transition to, could the, let's see, the refugee board in back describe a situation in which you were pressured or tempted or made an exception in the impartiality provision?
We're talking here about the possibilities of, being tempted or bribed, trying to compliance things that when you act as a going between your girlfriend. Of course, you have to make that clear that you can help with the language, but with the knowledge, still doing translate tests, like I do with the driver's license. So that is something that comes up. And typically, they either take you or not take you, or they understand, especially when you speak with a family member that is familiar with the language and what goes on in the real world. We have a case here that our friend is going to explain where he was tempted as well, and he dealt with it. Perhaps
yeah, I can imagine what he has said, my friend, like in one traffic court case, the defendant who is a tax cab driver, and when I met him in front of the courtroom, he said to me that please go back, don't show up so that I can give you $100 instead of taking $9 from the court. And then I said to him that not to say it again, if you say it again to other people, you'll get in trouble. It's not my job. And probably he might be experienced back home when he was doing or practicing that work. But here he kind of doesn't work. So don't do this thing next time, otherwise you get in trouble.
So you personally gave some advice to the person? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, like I said to him, that's not my job. I'm not going to do this thing, and don't do this next time.
Okay. So there was pressure to be partial to one side or another, and you resisted that pressure. Okay, thank you. Would anyone propose any modification to the wording of the impartiality provision in your code of ethics? Table the Thorn Among Roses discussed that. And we have a terminologist there who knows all about wording, so.
Yeah, we unfortunately don't have much to add. Like this table here, we spoke about an instance where an interpreter was left alone with the client, and the service provider said, help them to fill out this form. This happens frequently, for example, at the Workplace Safety Insurance Board, where the form is quite lengthy. So that was the situation we discussed, very similar to this. Do you want me to address the other two?
Well, just very briefly, if you think that the provision covers circumstances like the one you mentioned, or if some wording could be changed to accommodate these real-life situations.
No, but the one thing that we did talk about is that very often in those scenarios, if the interpreter takes a stand and says, no, that's not my role to be alone with the client, then somebody like the WSIB will call the agency that sent them. They'll say something to the effect of, the interpreter we had last week did it, why don't you?
Exactly.
They call the agency, and then the agency gets on the phone with you and says, you're the problem, couldn't you just fill out the form with the person?
Yeah.
So changing the wording of the tenant, perhaps not, but what are the things that we could do to dialogue with all sides to say, look, these are the basic ground rules that everybody has to respect.
In other words, client education. We all know the code of ethics. They don't.
Exactly.
The code of ethics.
May I add?
One very brief statement, yes.
I really would like to support this strongly, because we interpreters on daily basis have this kind of problems, that service provider starts asking from us to do something what is completely out of our role. Let's say I particularly was asked to dress up the patient. The doctor asked me to dress up the patient, and I refused. And I went to the agency, I explained the situation, they said, bravo, you acted adequately. The following day exactly happened what Andrew said. the Western Hospital called the agency and said, every other interpreter is helping, she doesn't. We don't want to see her anymore. And the agency took me off the roster just because of it. And since then, I wasn't able to get back, no matter that the explanation was clear, and no matter that the president of the agency agreed with my action the previous day, the outcome was like that.
Did not back you up to that extent. Unfortunate. All right, and finally, the tables that discussed professional demeanor and detachment. Excuse me. Professional demeanor and detachment. Could the dream team tell us about either pressure or temptation to violate that tenet? The dream team.
I think a few of us here have had a situation where it was mostly after the assignment had been completed, where you're not supposed to leave with the client, obviously. So you kind of like find a way to kind of hang in the area away from everybody else. And the service provider had actually come up to us and asked us if we found that the client was in his or her right mind, or if there was anything that we found that was not true. In my experience, what I have said was that I'm not a doctor, but we can certainly call the client and ask him, which he did not like. Needless to say, I was called back again because it's not my job to tell them whether I find or if I decline the person in any way, shape, or form. But it has happened to that. And also, there's a question here that says that the valid exception has been granted. There has been a time where a word I'm an interpreter, so a word in Portuguese, especially with the elderly, frightens them to death, literally. But it's not my job to say or to educate the service provider that this word is going to scare them. It's, I'm assuming that they've worked in the field enough time to know that they've had a reaction from them so many times to reword it. They also have had a situation where the word does not exist in their language. And then at that point, I will say, I'm sorry, but the interpreter needs an alternate or synonym to that word because it does not exist in our language. And I haven't had any problems of getting another word or a synonym or anything that would help. And I've never had where I personally switched the words on my own. Because I find that if you do that, it will kind of like backfire on you.
All right. I think that what a lot of you have done is discuss multiple tenets of the Code of Ethics, and that's inevitable because they overlap. There is no fine or bold line that divides them. So what seems like an impartiality issue could also be a confidentiality issue or an accuracy issue. But it sounds like the Code of Ethics, the way it's written, accommodates all of these situations. The real problem is that not everyone knows what the Code of Ethics says and how it's written, or just is not aware that it applies in a situation they're dealing with. And when I say not everyone, I mean not all of the clients that interpreters work with. So I know that you're burning with things you want to say, comments and arguments and stories, and I would like to hear all of them, but I think we're going to take a coffee break now, and then we're going to shift the emphasis of the discussion just a little bit.